the main person. I hope you can all see Barry's first slide. I'm going to kind of move the slides on when Barry asks me to. But I thought I'd firstly just say a warm welcome. My name's Julian Park. I'm at the University of Reading, and I'm the chair of ICA-Edu, with ICA-Edu being the European Association of Life Science Universities, which I'm sure many of you are universities that are members. This is the latest in a series of webinars we're running, just short webinars for an hour or so on topical subjects. And the title of this webinar actually comes from a rectors forum that we held in Lille a couple of months ago, where one of the key topics was around One Health and how universities and rectors and deans of universities were considering the One Health challenge within their organisations. And we thought it'd be really useful to follow that up, to hear from. Well, we heard in Lille that UCD was one of the institutions that were making rapid progress with introducing One Health concepts within the curricula, and so then out of that, following conversations with Barry, we were lucky enough that Barry would come and speak to us on one of the modules he's put together related to One Health. So I'm delighted that Barry McMahon has joined us from University College Dublin in Ireland, and he's going to give an overview of how this module became conceived and his experiences of teaching it in the last few years. Barry's an associate professor with research and teaching interests that are fairly broad, but mainly in the area of wildlife conservation and zoonotic diseases, and obviously the overall kind of One Health concept. So Barry, with no further ado, I will hand over to you, and we all look forward to hearing from you. We hope that before 10 to the hour or so, we'll have some time to fit in some questions. People can put questions in the chat if they want to, or we'll do a show of hands at the end kind of thing where people have got questions to ask. So Barry, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Julian, and thank you very much to you and your association for giving me the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon, and also thanks to Simon as well for helping in the background in terms of getting the bits and pieces together. So I'm going to give you a bit of a reflective piece with some details about how a One Health module that I deliver, how it came about and how it sort of evolved over time, and maybe how I see a vision for using this approach into the future. It's really an approach that I believe in very firmly, that the connectedness between, human health, animal health, ecosystem health, and plant health, it's really pivotal in terms of actually how we develop strategies into the future. That's just a sort of a personal view of mine. I'm really lucky, I think, because I work in the School of Agriculture and Food Science here in UCD, and it's a really pertinent place to have these views because of the impact that the food system has into sort of where it goes, and also the results of some food system activities in relation to biodiversity, etc. So if you can go on to the next slide, Julian, please. So, as you know, just on that picture of all the birds there, I'm a conservation biologist who works in the School of Agriculture, and I use conservation biology and I use agriculture to be able to sort of show how important agriculture is to the maintenance of these species, but also how there's an interlinkage between how these species are important in relation to reflecting the resilience of agricultural systems for production. And if you bear that in mind in terms of the fact that One Health, if you like, came from, if you bear in mind that One Health really sort of came out of a veterinary epidemiology perspective, with a focus towards sort of public health and medical perspectives, biodiversity and its importance in relation to sort of human health maybe isn't as obvious as it should be. And that's why I think this sort of idea of working within an agriculture school is really, really important. So next slide, please. So what I'll do today is I'll give you a very brief introduction into One Health, the way that I see it. And you've got this already, but this is just to sort of lead us into where, you know, the origins of the module that I deliver came from, where the outline of the current module sits, how I deliver, how this is taught, who's involved in teaching it, some of the assessment techniques that I have for it. I suppose I've got a link to some of the publications that have resulted sort of due to the module, and that's in two ways. One is because my colleagues and I have used the module as a way to reflect upon the development of ideas that have resulted in publications, but also through the training of students who've gone through the module and have decided to actually do a research project related to the topics and have gone on to produce publications out of that. It's not in any way, shape or form a core deliverable from the activities within the module, but it's sort of like a positive side effect, if you like, from some of the activities in relation to the module itself. And finally, I'll just give you my views in terms of where I would see the future of One Health in relation to education. And this will be very much, I have to say, my view, even within UCD. A lot of my UCD colleagues wouldn't necessarily share the same focus in relation to where this sits. But I suppose this is the part where I can say it's my module, so I can do what I want with it, as long as it's sort of educationally accurate. And with the One Health approach, you can adjust the focus in relation to particular elements. I see some of some colleagues who I've talked to before on this, so I can see Susanna there. We have certainly discussed elements around this idea. So I don't intend to be too long. I hope to be finished, within half an hour or so that we can have some discussions, or if anyone has any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so next slide, please, Julian. So One Health, what is it? The latest sort of version of it looks at sort of the interlinkages between animal health, human health, environmental health, and plant health. And this is a sort of a step up to take in the components of plant health, which are really, really important. It's not an area that I sort of focus on, but it is something that we really need to be cognizant of, particularly maybe in the light of the fact that, most of our food system is basically dependent upon that. So that's a really, really critical component. So if you go to the next slide, please, Julian. And if you go back to sort of the origins of One Health, it came out of one of the SARS outbreaks in 2003. Was the WHO basically developed this concept of integrating the different approaches. And our colleagues in the Swedish One Health came up with an umbrella term. And you can see there's a whole lot of detail here in terms of what it covered. There might be a little bit too much to take in one go. But essentially, what I like about this is that if you basically go and you say that you're implementing One Health approach, you can use any of these elements, I would say, as long as you at least attempt to understand the impact that it's going to have on human health, animal health, ecosystem health, and plant health. But there's a whole sort of range of different disciplines, you know, and those are the ones that are across the top, like environmental health, ecology, veterinary medicine, etc. And then another sort of different way to look at it is the scale of the impact. So is it at an individual level? Is it at a population level? Or is it maybe at an ecosystem or a landscape level? And then you have all the different sort of zoonotic infections and the comparative medicine and translational medicine elements to consider. It's really, really broad. But if you go on to the next slide, Julian, you'll see basically what the latest version of this approach is. So in a sort of a one line summary, we're trying to look at what One Health is. So it's an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. And that's basically what it's about. So from my perspective, as long as you're thinking about the impact of humans, and as long as you're thinking about the impact on animals, and as long as you're thinking about the impact of ecosystems, it is a One Health approach. There needs to be at least some reflection in terms of those approaches. They don't necessarily have to be direct impacts, but there needs to be at least reflection on what the knock-on effects are. Okay, next slide, please. So I was very lucky to work with a professor here called Jeremy Gray, and essentially in 2007 he handed me over a module called Epidemiology and Zoonoses, and that's where this One Health module came from, and it was very much focused upon the details around understanding zoonoses, and it was offered to a core elective to agri-environment science students in the Bachelor of Agricultural Science here in UCD, and that had been the case up until about up from the 1990s. And what we mean by a core elective, because one of my colleagues didn't understand this, so what we have in this degree program is that we have 5 modules, and you have to select 4 of those 5. So it's not an overall elective, it's sort of more of a sort of a core elective. And it was selected by a lot of students, but not all of the students. And it was targeted at students who were, you know, in their final years. So they were deemed to be, you know, reasonably focused in terms of their academic endeavors. Next slide, please. So sort of, if I can sort of jump time frame, in 2011, I developed a master's in wildlife conservation and management in the School of Agriculture and Food Science. Again, the context is quite important where it is. So we're in the School of Agriculture and Food Science. And the key theme of the wildlife program master's was wildlife conservation, but also One Health in terms of the epidemiology and zoonoses of zoonotic diseases. And linked in with that, it was wrapped in the flavour of human-wildlife conflict, with, I suppose, the fact that if you're trying to deal with any element of conservation, there's always going to be human-wildlife conflict. So since that time, there's been a sort of a composition of agri-environmental students. About 40% of them have been, about 40% of the module has been composed of agri-environmental science students. 40% has been wildlife students, and then there'd be general elective students would be about 20%. Next slide, or next point. So it's still sort of centered around risk assessment in zoonoses. And what I mean by a risk assessment in zoonoses is that I'm trying to bring students to the point at which they're able to carry out a risk assessment on a number of zoonoses. And by that, we mean that they'd be able to understand the history of the zoonoses, what the disease is like, a description of the biology, the epidemiology, what diagnosis and what treatment is available, the prevention and control aspects, and then a risk characterization, which sort of wraps up all the previous 7 points into a tight sort of understanding of the previous points. Next slide, please, Julian. So it was named epidemiology and zoonoses up until 2015, but then we changed it to One Health because, you know, the weight of the movement that was going on, and also at that time I joined in around that time I sort of picked up my One Health research activities, and I joined an EU cost action called the Network for the Evaluation of One Health, which some of you may have heard. Excuse me. And in conjunction with that, I sort of broadened out the content to deal with other sort of issues beyond just the problem around zoonotic emergence. It was sort of evolved in terms of dealing with more how the changes in biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis were leading to zoonotic infections. We were trying to challenge the idea around antimicrobial resistance and what role that was having in specific zoonoses, but as a challenge in itself. And also, many of you are probably aware of this, but you know, just as one short summary, the WHO reckons that around 2010 that 10 out of the 11 new diseases were zoonoses. So diseases that were occurring in humans were coming from animal origins, and the vast majority of them were coming from animal origins. So in order to have like a situation, or in order to prevent a situation where there was a long list of zoonotic diseases, I would prepare a short slide on these new diseases, which would give students an awareness of the disease and maybe the main pathologies around it, or even the main geographies around these diseases. So, you know, SARS-CoV-2 is an example of this. It's obviously the most recent and most dramatic example of this. But there are new diseases emerging all the time. So I wanted to be able to capture that while still maintaining the integrity of dealing with established zoonotic diseases that were important to be familiar with, and also were reassuring in terms of developing an understanding of what a risk assessment was. Next slide, please, Julian. So basically speaking, what the module deals with is understanding what the One Health concept is about, understanding the epidemiology and zoonoses of zoonoses in general. With that, you need to be able to appreciate the utility and limitations of different diagnostic and investigative approaches. So essentially, what sort of tools do you have to understand these diseases? And then to go on a little bit further, we would aim in sort of the learning objective number 4, which is probably the main one, to describe the biology and epidemiology of selected zoonoses, both of particular Irish importance or zoonoses of international importance, and perform a risk analysis on those, which I've sort of outlined already. And specifically, I suppose I've added my own particular learning objective in terms of to understand why is it that there's a linkage between biodiversity changes or dynamics and zoonotic emergence. Next slide, please. One of the reasons why the students like to take this module is because it's topical. It's topical, it's relevant, and it's impacting us, you know, on a daily basis, either in our faces, like it has been for the last number of years, or in certain parts of the world. For example, you know, in West Africa, there's regular outbreaks of Ebola, which has really serious implications in terms of the lifestyles of communities there. So this idea as well that human disease is really being sourced from animal diseases. Again, this is a really, really topical approach, and it gives us a sense of how we can explain to students that the interface or the connection between humans and animals is massive, and that interface is increasing, and with that you get greater exchange of diseases, and particularly of wildlife diseases hitting human populations. Next slide, please. So in terms of the module outline, what I would do is I would spend probably the first 2 to 3 weeks of a 12-week term explaining to the students what the One Health initiative is. Students need to understand the terminology around epidemiology. So they need to learn the language around epidemiology, because these are maybe agriculture students or life science students that are not, they're not medics, they're not vets. So they need to learn that terminology. They need to understand the terminology and the facts around diagnostic techniques, and understanding how to read a ROC curve, or sensitivity, specificity, information around diagnostic tests. And they need to learn some of the information around how we describe zoonoses, so where they live, how they behave, their life cycles, etc. So this first 4 points, which is I found quite interesting delivering it. This is the learning the language part, I would describe it. And then when you go on to the next points, please, Julian. So when you go on to the next 2 points, that the information is there, that the discussion around antimicrobial resistance, which is one that was never really part of the original epidemiology of zoonoses, but have integrated into the One Health module, so that again this can be described, and we treat this almost as a zoonoses, but there's a specific set of lectures that deals with this. And also then, so when we get on to going through the individual zoonoses and we do the risk assessment on these, that at least when I run through an example of a disease, that a student is able to at least be familiar with the information, and then by the end of it, and by the time they get to the end of the term, that they can put the bits and pieces together to carry out an effective risk assessment, so they can, in a broad sense, say that this is a high, medium, or low risk. Next slide, please. So in terms of the contributors, I'm really lucky in UCD that we're a comprehensive university. So we do have a school of veterinary, we do have a school of medicine, and then we have sort of a school of agriculture and other biological scientists who may be able to contribute to this. But specifically, what I have is veterinary public health specialists. I have a public health doctor, veterinary epidemiologists contribute, ecologists, and there's a centre for food safety, which is able to fit into this contribution in relation to dealing with a range of different zoonotics. So I can ask the experts in these areas. So, for example, I might do the risk assessments in relation to, say, Lyme disease and rabies and COVID, but then I can ask my colleague in food safety to deal with Campylobacter and E. coli and salmonellosis. So we can sort of harness that expertise there, while all the time being aware of the nature of the audience, that you're not dealing with specialists who are doing degrees in any one of the specialist areas. In terms of delivery, it's done in this trimester, in autumn trimester. It's designed as a face-to-face module. I mean, we're constantly being reminded that we are a face-to-face university. So, so you know, the one exception from that was when there was obviously we were in lockdown, and we had to deliver this module online, and we also had to change the assessment, so it was altered to a sort of a risk, or to a written assignment, rather than the sort of the face-to-face exams that we would do regularly. In terms of the groups, the group numbers, it's relatively small. So there's about 20 to 30 students would take the module each year. I think there's a potential to grow that a bit. But again, sort of timetabling and clashes with various other sort of core subjects probably curtail that a little bit. In terms of the facilities that are available for file sharing and for lecture sharing, we use Brightspace here in UCD. So next slide, please, Julian. In terms of assessment, I do a short quiz during the semester, sort of week 8 of the 12-week semester. So to examine and to give students feedback on whether they understand the fundamentals of what the pathogens are, like, you know, basically what are the pathogens, where are they found, what's their life cycle. At the end of the semester, there's an in-person 2-hour exam. I should say the short quiz is only 20%. The 2-hour exam is an 80% exam. Next slide, please. And I have this technique which I sort of evolved with Jeremy Gray, where about 3 to 4 weeks from the end of the term, I will post up the questions that will appear in the exam, but it's not obviously the exam itself. So there would be 50 short questions posted, and in the exam, 10 of those would appear, and you would do 10 of those as a student. And this basically is to examine the breadth of the course. So to get everything from understanding One Health to epidemiology to a little bit about diagnostics, etc., the whole way up to the zoonotic infections. And then in terms of the long questions, we cover about 15 zoonoses in the course itself. And what I would do is I would post 4 of those, and students would have a choice to do 2 of those 4 in terms of carrying out a risk assessment. So that same process again, history, pathology, biology, epidemiology, diagnosis, prevention, control, risk characterization. So that's a sense of how the exam is, or how it's structured. What I suppose we're looking to produce, or what I'm looking to produce, is someone who can speak the language around this topic and can describe the information around zoonotic infections. I suppose what I've always tried to do is for students, and even this goes for some of my other modules. So I have a module in wildlife conservation, which I try and bring some of the elements from each into the other. But I'm all the time trying to see if students can understand the process of an externality. So do they understand that if they control something like rabies in Europe, that there's going to be an impact as a result of that? Not only do you have all the positives of the fact that you don't have rabies in humans, and you don't have rabies in wildlife and all the rest, but that diseases are sort of ecological processes in some respects, and that if you remove rabies, another disease is going to come in. And it's been shown that, not to the same extent, but things like Echinococcus multilacarius has re-emerged in parts of Central Europe where rabies has been removed. Or, for example, when you look at, okay, these are just 2 specific examples that I would refer to. So when you look at a plague outbreak, that you don't go and control rats during a plague outbreak, because if you do, there's more likely to be a situation where, you know, for example, that the fleas will jump onto the humans and you will exacerbate the problem from a human context. Those are just 2 sort of contextual examples as to how you might look at externalities and to see if students can think in that type of a way. And that's really a One Health way, in terms of the fact that you need to see the fact that, human health, animal health, ecosystem health, they are totally connected, so that you can't just sort of play with one and not expect an impact on the other. And that's really the essence of the module itself. Next slide, please. So what I've found is students generally find this topic interesting. They find it different. They find the delivery different. They find what's been asked of them is different. And they like the way at the end that the structure of the way that the questions are outlined relate back to the topics that are going to be examined, and the way that the information in the course is linked very much to that. The good students really enjoy the complexity. Okay, the weaker students sort of struggles with the details in relation to, I suppose, the biological facts, and also the fact that, there is a lot of terminology around diagnostics. There is a lot of terminology around epidemiology and around, the introduction element. The really sort of, the real thing that some of the weaker students I've noticed would request is that they want sort of smaller tasks to be carried out during the term and to be graded, or they wanted, one specific comment was that they wanted reward for turning up to the lectures, which really isn't within my philosophy, if you like. Even within the weaker students, there's a huge sort of fluctuation in terms of the amount of guidance that they're looking for. What I took as a really positive feedback is that the master's program that I run, I get the students to talk to an external examiner without me there. And I look for the feedback in terms of how they found the modules, how they found the continuity of it. And they really like the fact that there's a link between wildlife conservation, animal-human health in the form of One Health, and human-wildlife conflict. So they like that continuity. So as a building block, as a core module, which you have to do as part of a master's, I like the way that it sort of functions in that respect. Next slide, please. So some of the module inspired outcomes. So Jeremy and I, it only took us about 16 years to write this paper, but we got there in the end, which we sort of took out sections which we use in the teaching in the module, and we described how that was important to understand the ecosystem change and zoonosis emergence. The other two papers were more sort of reflections upon where maybe at a core level of agriculture, where I discussed with colleagues who I work with, how this is sort of the ideas within this module might fit into that. And out of that, we sort of produced a short commentary piece on One Health and the food system. And the other one was to link One Health and soil. So if you go on to the next slide. The next slide sort of relates more to where students had done the module and said, look, I'm really interested in that. And they wanted to look at that. So there was an element of the initial training around antimicrobial resistance was really useful, and antimicrobial resistance was quite low hanging fruit from an Irish perspective to look at that in wildlife, and it sort of linked in, and it was a nice sort of way for me to sort of show the relevance of what the module has in terms of a research output, but also in terms of the practicalities of dealing with antimicrobial resistance and how that is a problem that's not going away anytime soon. So those were just sort of specific individuals who went through the module and were able to produce something. Next slide, please. In terms of the future for One Health. This is just, again, a vision that I sort of have, and I discussed this quite a bit with some of the networks that I'm involved in. If you look at this data that's aggregated by Vycroft Smil from a publication in 2011, and if you look along the x-axis, you'll see the dates, and if you look along the y-axis, you'll see the sort of the millions of tons of carbon, I think it is, or the millions of tons in terms of weight. And it relates to the amount of terrestrial vertebrate biomass. Now, what those different colors represents is the most important thing. So you have wild animals as green, domestic animals as blue, and humans as red. So as you look from the years, from the, say, the year 1900 to 1950 to the year 2000 to 2050, if those data don't terrify you, well, then it's, maybe I'm missing something. But it's this idea, and this is where the One Health approach comes in, is this idea that the connectedness between humans' health, animal health, and ecosystem health, and the interface that's been increased between humans and wild animals and domestic animals means that there's going to be more exchange of pathogens, is a really, really concerning issue. And if you go on to the next slide, this is why I sort of feel that if you approach One Health, and this again is a very simplified version of how I would look at this, if you put the food system at the center of the One Health paradigm, and you look at how that impacts in terms of its environmental management. So think of all the things that are left behind as a result of the food system and the production within the food system. So you're talking about greenhouse gases, climate change, talking about soil erosion, biodiversity loss, which is my pet interest, all of those challenges around that. So they're as a result of the food system. And then if you look forward in terms of the impacts of the food system, you have public health indicators. And say, for example, let's just mention two very big ones. The production, let's say, or the realization of new zoonotic infections, and other public health indicators. For example, we would look at something like obesity in a human health setting. And for those of you who are familiar, obesity in Ireland is going to be the epidemic in terms of, it's labelled as one of the epidemics to occur in the next five to 10 years. And this is all sort of forward and backward and totally and utterly linked to the food system. And this is an extremely sort of simplified idea as to how you could put One Health and the connectedness of the components of One Health at the center, and you could link a whole range of different agricultural and food production system elements to that. And I think it would be a very, very nice mechanism by which you could explain and translate those processes to our students in the future. Okay, with that, I'll wrap up. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Barry, thank you very much. I found that fascinating, very thought-provoking, and also informative on a practical point of view as well. You know, what we do as educators. So, thank you very much. I hope others enjoyed it. I note several people have posted questions in the chat, so I'll maybe ask them to come in rather than me verbalise the question. Jos, do you want to come in and just make the point you wanted to make?
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Barry. Well, I had a remark there about ecologists and food safety specialists, which come in the course as contributors. But from the outline of the course, I was wondering at that point in your presentation what their actual contribution would be. The later slides made that already more clear, but still, your course or your module seems to be heavily developed based on the animal dimension of the One Health. so the position of the ecology, the ecosystems on the one hand, and the food safety, so the human element on the other hand. Can you please elaborate a little on that?
Yeah. I suppose if you look through a risk assessment, right, and as you go down through it, so that the pathology would deal with the disease that occurs in humans. So that would be like that would be the impact. So if you have a situation like Lyme disease, so if an individual catches Lyme disease, they could have, prostration or extreme exhaustion, or they might have neurological problems in the long term. So that might be the way in which you deal with it from a human perspective. So what are the impacts if it occurs at a human perspective? And then in terms of the ecological aspects, we might look at sort of, well, how does it circulate in the wild? So how do we know how many wild mammals or wild birds are actually carrying it in areas where humans might go hiking and therefore acquire the disease as a result of going hiking? You raise a really good question. So to deal with the wild diseases like Lyme disease, it's easier to do that. You raise an interesting question though in terms of, so how do you bring ecology or ecological information, and how do you make it relevant to a disease like Campylobacter in terms of as a foodborne disease, right? As a disease that occurs when people don't cook chicken properly. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, it's interesting to note, first of all, that about 20% of ducks, geese, and swans carry it naturally. Okay, so even letting students know that information and enabling them to be aware of that is one. And to assess whether there's a connectedness between, say, chicken production and in an industrial chicken producing area and the wild areas. So we would have sort of different categories for those different types of habitats, and how that gets into the food system. Is there a connectedness there, or are these different processes that are going on that, okay, we really need to focus our control? So we would do sort of hazard analysis of critical control points to get into the sort of the food science element of it. And we would say, well, wild animals that carry Campylobacter, they're not a risk. But what is the risk is the fact that in these high intensity chicken production areas, you need to be aware of the fact that there's a huge amount of Campylobacter there, that when you go into a shop, you need to tell consumers that 75% of the chicken that they're handling there is going to have Campylobacter. So they're going to have to cook it properly, and they're going to have to wash their hands. So that's the risk element there. If I'm making sense at all, in terms of the fact that you have diseases where there's a big gradient of activity from wildlife to sort of just outside the human elements and to the domestic, or there's a much sort of shorter chain in terms of where the risk is. Does that make sense in terms of trying to bring ecology into it? And I have to say, with my food safety colleague, it's probably taken me 10 years for me to actually explain to him how important the ecological aspects of life are to food safety. And then again, that's just my point, because for him to explain how important microbiology is to human health is a much cleaner, easier message.
Makes sense, Barry. Thank you.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jos. Anna, do you want to come in and pose your question?
Yeah. Hello. So the problem is that the very veterinary point of view and medical doctor's point of view, when you look at the zoonosis, is different, and they are very often paradoxical. The knowledge which student has from the courses, there are not overlapped or very little. So in the context to the message to the society, maybe such courses should be also available for the vets and medical students, because when they look at the zoonotic diseases from the veterinary medical perspective in the context of the ecology and all these aspects we talked about. So I think that the transmission of this knowledge maybe would be more wide, in fact. So that's why I am asking about the availability of such courses at your university.
Thanks, Anna. It's a good question, and what I found generally with a sort of a preamble, and then I'll get to your point, is that the veterinary degrees and the medical degrees are so packed with content that they don't really have time for.
No.
So what I have had a little bit of joy with is, so we do a module here, and there's a module that's given to public health doctors who are doing the MPH, and it's veterinary public health, and it's there. I basically produce a condensed 2-hour lecture to those guys, and I explain to them about the importance of biodiversity and why biodiversity loss is actually a massive human health risk.
Yeah.
And I've had a little bit of impact there, and you can see the students sort of thinking, because they think in a different way, because they're trained differently. So what one of my New Year's resolutions is to actually get back and try and talk to the person who runs that degree program and see if we can find a way to slot this in. But I might need to change it as well, because it needs to fit them as well. That's the issue. Everyone wants the module to be perfect for them or for their degree program. And that's a challenge, because you can't blame them.
So we have I am a vet, so we have in our program the margin for the voluntary courses. So maybe during the vet studies it is probably more possible than for medical students. I don't know. However, I think that such context is absolutely necessary for our colleagues and especially for those who are the vets for the food producers animals. So I think that so thank you very much. I think that I can ask my dean and my colleagues to introduce such a voluntary course, maybe not in one semester, but maybe a little bit shorter. But I think that it is that such context is absolutely necessary for them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. We've got two questions, so we'll perhaps just run over by a couple of minutes. But Dave, good to see you. Do you want to pose your question? I'm not surprised by the topic, of course.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Barry. Really great talk. I'm a pharmacologist at Leeds. Question was that I do something similar where my students use a design thinking approach to work with students in Nigeria as their final year project to create solutions to an UN SDG. And the output for that, and the biggest learning for them is the approach rather than the content. So I was thinking, have you thought about using at the moment you're assessing learning, switching to using learning for assessment? So get them to, as mine do, an e-portfolio or business style report, with smart recommendations, so they can, take that learning and apply it sort of when they go into the workplace.
That's a great idea. I mean, I have to say that I changed things a little bit from the way Jeremy used to do it. So Jeremy used to force all the students to stand up and give, not force, but he would actively encourage the students to stand up and give a presentation on their own disease. So they would actually, they would give the lecture. So the lecture on the risk assessment of rabies would be by student X. The risk assessment lecture would be done online by student Y. Do you know what I mean? So there was an awful lot about going through the process rather than just actually writing down through it, because researching the risk assessments is more like what you're describing rather than actually listening to someone talk about the risk assessment. So that might be something that you could do, is that I could give them sort of the outline of a a risk assessment or a brief outline to a disease and tell them to go away. They'd need to do it independently, though. That's the issue. They'd need to do it on. Do you have the students do it as groups, or do you have them?
Mine are all team based. So
okay.
Everything, all the creation of the outputs are team based. All the data is team based. They're just their final portfolio or the final business report is individual. So all the creation of the sort of, as in your case, the risk assessments and whatever the background to the disease would be a team based activity.
Okay, how many numbers is it? 2 or 3 or something like that?
Teams are up to 5.
Okay.
And then we've got probably about 30 students doing this.
Now is the time that we sort of reassess our assessment, if you like. So I might have a think about that, because.
And the other sort of thing is they've got this portfolio business style report they can give to employers, and it really does sort of set them apart from other students who've been assessed through exams or other sort of means.
Yeah, that's one of the things as well out of our degree program, is that the way in which our final year students, our undergrad students, are assessed. They do so many reports and things like that the employers do like that, but that sounds like an icing on the cake type approach. If you have these, if you have a different, if you've something, anything that stands out with that, so it sounds very interesting. I might be in touch with you on that. Thank you.
That'd be good. Yeah, thanks, Dave, for those comments. And maybe if you want to follow up afterwards, Barry, that'd be grand. Let's take one last question before we wrap. Susanna, you have an interesting question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Susanna. I'm a Swedish veterinarian. I run the SLU Future One Health, which is a transdisciplinary platform on One Health in the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And you talk. It's a very nice talk, thank you. With the biodiversity and the ecosystems approaches and so on, do you also talk about the fact that zoonosis go both ways? We had a webinar during COVID because people were talking about wildlife being the source of all evil. To discuss this, and I had zoologists describing all the different species and humans as just one host animal and not so very different. It's just the way we behave and the exposure and so on. But from the microbial point of view, people are not that different, and some zoonosis are actually excreted like at a high rate from people, and animal exposure could. So, I mean, we excrete things into the environment, so especially wildlife would be exposed to that. So do you also talk about these two-way?
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is a real bugbear of mine, actually, and that's one of the reasons why Jeremy and I wrote that manuscript, was to basically challenge the biodiversity dilution hypothesis, which is probably what one of the things, so that there's no such thing as there is no such thing as amplification or dilution, as far as I'm concerned. It's all context. Because it really, I found it really, really frustrating reading it. I also found it when we were asked during COVID to comment on some of the reports. So obviously, like, I'm a conservation biologist at heart, very closely followed by someone who's interested in food production. But what really did bother me was within the IPBES reports on the pandemics, it did state almost that, wildlife is the source of all evil. So I don't know if there was enough weight behind the reviews that went in on those, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Ecosystem Services reports on pandemics, but it was very irresponsible the way it was written, in my view, anyway. And a few of us definitely did make that point in relation to the fact that diseases go different ways. And the classic example, one of the ones why we were so interested in it, Jeremy was an expert in Lyme disease. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work, Susanna, but he really did retire a number of years ago. And if you look at Lyme disease and you look at it in Britain, if you look at it in the US and you look at it in Ireland, it behaves totally differently. So it amplifies under situations when biodiversity is reduced. So in the States, if you reduce biodiversity, you get more white-footed mice, you get more reservoirs, and you get more disease in humans. Whereas in Ireland, it's exactly the opposite. It gets amplified by where there's more different ranges of different hosts, particularly in somewhere like Killarney National Park, which is a sort of an old ancient woodland, and you have lots of different rodents running around the place, lots of different insectivorous birds, and you get loads of Lyme. So you've got the same disease doing exactly the opposite in different parts of the world. So I would completely agree with you, and it would be very convenient if the biodiversity dilution hypothesis was true as a conservationist, because you just say, like, then all we need to do is maintain as much wildlife as possible and we'll have less disease. But life isn't that simple.
That sounds like a very good conclusion of this.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
absolutely. Life certainly isn't simple, is it? I think we need to draw to a close. Barry, thank you very much. A hugely thought-provoking talk, but also with a practical element that many of us can take and think about in the context of our own education. So thank you very much for that. Thank you for those that have joined, and thank you for those that have posed searching questions that I think Barry's answered equally comprehensively. So thank you very much. I hope you'll join us for the next webinar, which I think will take place in late January, early February, and we'll make sure that you're aware of that. I wish you all, as we move towards the winter break, I wish you all, a happy Christmas, and we'll see you on the other side, so to speak. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Julian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Barry, that was great. Thank you very much.